The weathered hands at the Broken Pine Tavern roared with laughter at the sight of the town's newest carpenter. This gentle craftsman with his wire-framed glasses and sawdust-covered apron seemed more at home with a chisel than a gun. They mocked his methodical movements, his careful measurements, completely blind to the fact that those same precise hands had once orchestrated the most sophisticated military operations in the Apache Wars. They would soon learn that mastery comes in many forms, and that sometimes the deadliest strategist is the one who appears most harmless. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The spring winds whipped through Silver Gulch, a mining town that had sprung up like a desert weed when silver was discovered in the Devil's Backbone Ridge 5 years ago. What had once been a simple prospectors' camp now boasted a bustling main street, complete with 3 saloons, a general store, and more troublemakers than any sheriff could handle alone. Daniel Harrison's morning routine took him from his modest carpentry shop to various construction sites around town, his leather tool belt creating a rhythm different from the usual gunfighter's swagger. His work-worn hands moved with surgical precision as he examined Mrs. Wu's broken storefront, calculating angles and measurements with a perfectionist's eye. The Colt revolver at his hip seemed almost apologetic, like a concession to local custom, rather than a weapon. Inside the Broken Pine, Marcus the Jackal Reynolds watched through grimy windows, nursing his morning whiskey with barely concealed contempt. "Look at him," he sneered at his companions, a group of notorious claim jumpers who'd been terrorizing smaller mining operations. Measuring twice, cutting once, like some proper Easterner. Bet he counts his bullets before loading them. The tavern erupted in cruel laughter, but old Samuel Green, watching from his usual spot by the pot-bellied stove, merely smiled into his coffee cup. He'd been in Silver Gulch longer than most, and he remembered the stories from the Apache Wars, tales of a brilliant young cavalry officer who had revolutionized frontier warfare through careful planning and precise execution. Fewer still knew about the classified reports detailing operations so perfectly orchestrated that they seemed impossible. "You weren't here 3 weeks ago," Sarah Mitchell, the tavern's owner, said quietly as she wiped down the bar. Her sharp eyes never left the scene outside. "When those Wallace brothers tried throwing their weight around. One warning, delivered. With the same precision he uses to cut dovetail joints. Never seen 2 men back down so fast without a shot fired." Dr. Margaret Chen stepped onto her clinic's porch, her medical bag in hand. The town's only female doctor had earned respect through competence and determination. Much like the carpenter, she now watched with knowing eyes. She'd seen those careful hands do more than just craft furniture. They'd helped her set complex fractures, demonstrating an understanding of human anatomy that went far beyond woodworking. The quiet ones, she often mused, especially those with methodical minds, they're the ones who understand strategy best. Robert Cooper, the young assistant at the lumberyard, rushed up to Harrison with the morning's wood orders. The boy had flourished under the carpenter's mentorship, learning that true craftsmanship required both patience and precision. "Mr. Harrison," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of urgency that made several heads turn. "Wire from Fort Apache. The Phantom's gang broke out of Yuma prison 3 days ago. Burned Crystal Creek Station to the ground yesterday. They're headed this way." The name sent a chill through the morning crowd. James the Phantom Morrison and his gang had terrorized 4 territories before their capture 8 months ago. Their downfall had been like something from a dime novel, a military operation so perfectly executed that some said it must have been an inside job. But a few veterans had recognized the strategy, whispering about a legendary cavalry officer who had disappeared into civilian life after the wars. Harrison adjusted his glasses, studying the telegram with the same careful attention he gave to his woodworking plans. His eyes, sharp behind those humble lenses, scanned the street with military precision. He noted Reynolds's hand resting too close to his gun, saw the claim jumpers studying his movements with professional interest, and caught the subtle gathering of hard-eyed men around the tavern entrance. "How many escaped?" he asked quietly, his carpenter's calluses brushing against the telegram paper. "All 6, Robert replied nervously, glancing at the growing crowd. "The Phantom, his brother Luke, the Carson twins, all of them. Marshal's wire says they're leaving a trail of bodies from Yuma to here, 8 dead in Crystal Creek, including the sheriff. He hesitated, lowering his voice. "They pinned his badge to his chest with his own carpentry nails." Old Samuel hobbled over, his cane tapping against the boardwalk. The former cavalry scout's weathered face carried the weight of urgent news. "Daniel," he said softly, using the carpenter's first name as few dared to do, "just got word from my contact in Shadowvale. Morrison's been recruiting. 30 riders spotted heading north from the Mexican border yesterday. Mean ones, professionals." The methodical carpenter nodded absently, touching the spine of the small book visible in his apron pocket, a collection of ancient military strategies that never left his side. "Sun Tzu teaches us," he'd once told Robert, "that appearing ordinary when you are extraordinary can be your greatest advantage." Inside the broken pine, Reynolds' laughter grew louder, fueled by whiskey and false courage. 6 killers and 30 guns coming to town, he announced to the crowded room. "Reckon our woodworking friend might want to start measuring his own coffin boards." But Dr. Chen, still watching from her porch, saw what others missed. The subtle shift in Harrison's stance, the way those craftsmen's hands hung loose and ready at his sides, the calculating look behind those wire-rimmed spectacles. She'd seen that look before, right before those same steady hands had moved with deadly precision that had nothing to do with woodworking. Young Robert couldn't help but notice the growing tension in the air. He'd been apprenticing under Harrison for 6 months now, learning more than just woodworking. The carpenter had a way of teaching life lessons through his craft, speaking of angles and measurements in terms that sometimes seemed to hint at deeper meanings. "Every joint," he'd say, "is like a tactical position. Weak spots invite failure, but proper preparation ensures victory." Inside his workshop, Harrison's latest project stood as testament to his mastery. An intricately carved chest commissioned by the town bank, its complex locking mechanism, designed with the same precision he'd once used to plan military operations, contained tricks that would fool any would-be thief. But more telling were the hidden compartments, crafted with a knowledge of angles and sight lines that spoke of battlefield experience. Deputy Wilson, watching from the sheriff's office, couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the carpenter than met the eye. He'd seen Harrison's drawings, detailed sketches of buildings and street layouts that seemed more like tactical maps than construction plans. And there was something about the way the man moved, each step measured and deliberate, like a chess player thinking 3 moves ahead. The morning stage brought more than just mail to Silver Gulch. 3 rough-looking men stepped down, their eyes scanning the street with predatory intent. They carried their guns like tools of trade, but Harrison, measuring lumber for Mrs. Wu's storefront, noted their positioning with military assessment. They were scouts, professionals testing the town's defenses. Kate, Red Sullivan, owner of the Silver Lady Saloon across the street, had seen their kind before. In her younger days, she'd ridden with some of the toughest outfits in the territory. "They're placing themselves like artillery pieces," she muttered to herself, surprised by her own observation. Then she remembered the conversations she'd had with Harrison about the importance of proper positioning, conversations that had seemed to be about furniture arrangement, but now took on new meaning. The wind carried the scent of sage and gunpowder as storm clouds gathered over Devil's Backbone Ridge. Dr. Chen, organizing her medical supplies, couldn't help but recall the day 3 months ago when Harrison had helped her reorganize her clinic. His suggestions about equipment placement and workflow had revealed an understanding of battlefield triage that no simple carpenter should possess. The storm that was coming to Silver Gulch would test more than just a carpenter's skill with wood. It would reveal that sometimes the deadliest strategist is the one who builds things up rather than tears them down. Inside his workshop, Harrison's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he worked on what appeared to be simple wooden barricades for the town's defense. But like everything the carpenter crafted, there was more than met the eye. Each barrier contained precisely angled deflection points, carefully calculated to turn any gunfire back toward its source. He'd used similar principles during the Apache Wars, though back then he'd commanded men instead of manipulating wood. "Pass me that level, Robert," he called to his apprentice, who watched in fascination as seemingly ordinary lumber transformed into sophisticated defensive positions. The boy had begun to notice how his mentor's supposedly simple carpentry lessons often contained deeper meanings. Today's work was no exception. "Notice how the grain affects structural integrity," Harrison explained, his chisel moving with surgical precision. "Like human nature, wood has patterns. Understand them and you can predict where pressure will cause failure." The double meaning wasn't lost on Robert, who had seen the 3 scouts from the morning stage positioning themselves around town. Dr. Chen entered the workshop, her medical bag clutched tight. "Those men who arrived today," she said without preamble, "they've been asking questions about you, Daniel, about your background." She paused, watching him work. "They seem particularly interested in your time before Silver Gulch." Harrison nodded, his hands never stopping their methodical work. The Phantom always was thorough in his reconnaissance. Back in '73, during the Skeleton Canyon operation, his attention to detail almost... He caught himself, but Dr. Chen's sharp intake of breath told him she'd caught the slip. "You were there," she whispered. "That operation was legendary. An entire regiment of cavalry moving invisible through Apache territory, emerging exactly where the bandits least expected. The military strategist who planned it was never—" "Hand me that saw, Robert," Harrison interrupted, but his eyes met Dr. Chen's with quiet intensity. "Some things are better left in the past, though I suspect the past isn't quite finished with us yet." Outside, the town continued its nervous preparation. Kate Sullivan had transformed her Silver Lady Saloon into a strategic stronghold, though few realized it. Harrison's recent renovations had included reinforced walls, hidden shooting positions, and escape routes that seemed like simple storage spaces to the untrained eye. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Never seen a carpenter so particular about sight lines," she commented to old Samuel, who sat nursing his coffee. Almost like he was planning for something more than just customer comfort. Samuel's weathered face creased in a knowing smile. "Knew a cavalry officer once," he said quietly, "during the Apache Wars. Man could look at terrain and see things others missed. Angles of attack, defensive positions, routes of retreat, all laid out in his mind, like a master carpenter planning a joint." In the street, Marcus Reynolds and his claim jumpers had grown bolder, fueled by the tension in the air. They cornered young Tommy Wu, the laundry owner's son, accusing him of spying on their preparations. "Saw you watching us, boy," Reynolds snarled, his hand dropping to his gun. "Maybe we should teach you about respecting private business." The sound of a hammer striking wood rang out like a gunshot. Harrison stood in his workshop doorway, those craftsman's hands still holding his tools. "Tommy!" he called out, his voice carrying the same precision as his measurements. "I believe your mother needs those boards I cut for her shop front." Reynolds' face twisted in contempt. "This ain't your concern, Carpenter. Unless you're planning to build the boy a coffin." What happened next became the first whispered story of many to come. Harrison's movement was so subtle that most missed it. A simple flip of the hammer in his hand. But Reynolds suddenly found himself staring at his own gun belt, now lying in pieces on the ground, its holster split cleanly by a carpenter's nail, thrown with impossible accuracy. "Proper tool maintenance is essential," Harrison commented mildly, adjusting his glasses as Tommy scurried away. "Equipment can fail at the most inopportune moments when neglected." By midday, more strangers had drifted into town. They tried to be discreet, but Harrison's experienced eye noted their positioning. Each new arrival took up residence in carefully selected locations, high ground, corner buildings, positions that offered clear fields of fire. They were setting up a kill box, just as he would have done in his military days. 37, Robert reported quietly, delivering a fresh load of lumber. "That's how many new faces I've counted since sunrise. All of them armed, all of them watching the workshop." Harrison continued his work on what appeared to be simple street barricades. "And our other preparations?" "Miss Sullivan has the supplies. Stored just like you specified. Dr. Chen set up her secondary clinic in the old mine office. The widow Parker's place is ready too, though nobody understands why you insisted on reinforcing her root cellar." A ghost of a smile touched Harrison's lips. "In strategy, Robert, the obvious position is often the most dangerous. Sometimes the best defense lies where no one thinks to look." As afternoon shadows lengthened, the tension in Silver Gulch grew thick as summer storm clouds. Harrison's workshop had become a hub of quiet activity, though few understood the true purpose of the items he crafted. Simple wooden barriers concealed carefully planned firing positions. Ordinary furniture deliveries established cache points throughout town. Each piece of work contained hidden purpose, just as each of his actions carried tactical significance. Deputy Wilson, watching the carpenter work, finally voiced the question that had been nagging at him. "Those plans you drew up for the town's renovations," he said quietly, "they're not really about construction, are they?" Harrison's hands moved steadily as he shaped another piece of wood. "Every craftsman sees his medium differently, Deputy. A carpenter looks at a street and sees more than just buildings. He sees flow, pressure points, structural weaknesses." He paused, checking a measurement. "And sometimes he sees how to turn an entire town into a weapon." The deputy's eyes widened as understanding dawned. Every renovation project over the past 6 months, the new awnings on the general store, the relocated hitching posts, the seemingly random placement of water barrels, they formed a pattern. One that would only become clear when the shooting started. As evening approached, Marcus Reynolds gathered his men in the Broken Pine, their confidence bolstered by numbers and whiskey. "Tomorrow," he declared loudly, "when the Phantom arrives, we'll see what good a carpenter's tricks are against real killers." But old Samuel, overhearing from his usual spot, simply smiled and patted the military history book Harrison had lent him. "Know what makes a true craftsman?" he asked no one in particular. "Not the tools he uses, but understanding how each piece fits into the larger design." Dr. Chen, organizing her medical supplies for what everyone knew was coming, couldn't help but recall something Harrison had said while helping her arrange her clinic months ago. In medicine, as in strategy, preparation often determines the outcome before the battle begins. The storm clouds gathering over Devil's Backbone Ridge seemed to mirror the growing tension in Silver Gulch. Soon, everyone would learn that the most dangerous strategist isn't always the one who carries the most guns, but the one who sees the entire battlefield as a craftsman sees his workshop, every piece serving a purpose, every angle calculated, every position measured twice before the first shot is fired. Kate Sullivan watched from her saloon window as more of Reynolds's men took up positions around town. Her years riding with outlaw gangs had taught her to recognize professionals, and these men moved with practiced coordination. But something about their positioning bothered her. They were setting up exactly where Harrison's recent renovations seemed weakest. Almost like they're being guided into place, she murmured, remembering how the carpenter had insisted on replacing certain support posts, adjusting window heights, and even redesigning the hitching posts outside her establishment. Each change had seemed reasonable at the time, but now, inside his workshop, Harrison continued crafting what appeared to be simple defensive barriers. Robert watched in fascination as his mentor inserted specially carved wooden wedges into seemingly random positions. "Pressure points," Harrison explained, noting the boy's curiosity. "In wood, as in strategy, understanding where force will be applied allows you to control how it flows." He paused, checking an angle with mathematical precision. The strongest position isn't always the most obvious one. Dr. Chen returned with fresh bandages, her sharp eyes taking in the workshop's transformation. What looked like chaos to others revealed itself to her medical mind as carefully organized preparation. Every piece of lumber, every tool, every nail had its place, much like a surgeon's instruments before a complex operation. "The children?" Harrison asked quietly, his hands never stopping their work. "Secure in the Widow Parker's root cellar, just as you specified," she replied. "Though I still don't understand why it's there instead of the mine office where everyone expects." Harrison's smile held a hint of satisfied calculation. "The best ambush position is the one your enemy plans for you." He adjusted his glasses, the late afternoon light catching the lenses. "By tomorrow evening, the Phantom will learn that sometimes the deadliest trap is the one that looks exactly like what you expect." The first shot came at dawn, shattering the false peace of Silver Gulch. A lone rider emerged from the morning mist, his black duster adorned with a distinctive silver skull pin. Luke Morrison, the Phantom's younger brother. His approach revealed the first flaw in Reynolds' carefully laid plans, though only Harrison noticed it from his workshop window. "They're using the wrong angle of approach," he murmured to Robert, who helped position the last of their specially crafted barriers. "Sun at their backs might blind defenders, but it also casts revealing shadows." Luke Morrison reined his horse to a stop in the center of town, his voice carrying a predator's confidence. "Carpenter, word is you've been expecting us, brother. Sends his regards, says you remind him of someone, a certain cavalry officer, perhaps." Inside the workshop, Dr. Chen watched Harrison's hands continue their steady work on what appeared to be a simple chair leg. But her trained eye noticed how the wooden dowel he shaped could serve a different purpose entirely. "Interesting choice. Of wood," she commented quietly. "Osage orange, hard enough to split bone, dense enough to stop a bullet." "A craftsman's materials reflect his purpose," Harrison replied, testing the weight of his creation. "Though sometimes the true purpose isn't apparent until the moment of need." Luke's voice cut through the morning air again. "Come on out, Carpenter. Let's discuss how you've been preparing our welcome. Those reinforced walls, the repositioned water barrels. Reminds my brother of Skeleton Canyon. Same attention to detail, same precise planning." Harrison set down his tools with deliberate care. "Robert, remember what I taught you about viewing a project from multiple angles?" The apprentice nodded, suddenly understanding why his mentor had insisted he learn every detail of the town's layout. "Yes, sir. The obvious view is often the most deceiving." Outside, Luke Morrison's patience wore thin. He drew his revolver, with practiced speed aiming at the workshop door. "Time's up, strategist. Show yourself, or we start demonstrating what happens to towns that harbor military deserters." Harrison stepped onto his porch, those craftsman's hands hanging loose at his sides. Through his wire-rimmed spectacles, he studied Morrison with the same careful attention he gave to measuring lumber. Interesting choice of words, Mr. Morrison, though I believe you've miscalculated several key variables. Only miscalculation I see is yours, Luke sneered, thinking you could hide from us. By playing Carpenter. Brother says your type can never resist improving defensive positions. All those little changes you've made to this town. Might as well have signed your name. Ah, Harrison adjusted his glasses. But have you considered that obvious preparations might serve a purpose beyond the apparent? What happened next became another chapter in Silver Gulch's growing legend. Luke's draw was famous throughout the territories, a horizontal sweep that had killed 15 men. But before his gun cleared leather, a wooden dowel seemed to materialize in his gun hand, thrown with such precise force that it wedged perfectly into his revolver's mechanism. Proper tool selection is crucial, Harrison commented mildly, his position unchanged. Though I suspect your brother remembers that lesson from our last encounter. Luke stared at his disabled weapon in disbelief. Impossible. Nobody can throw that accurate. Not impossible, Mr. Morrison. Simply a matter of understanding trajectories and material properties. Your brother might recall similar principles from Skeleton Canyon, though we were working with larger projectiles then. The morning sun revealed more riders emerging from the mist, the Phantom's advance guard testing Silver Gulch's defenses. But Harrison's experienced eye noted their hesitation. His reputation from the Apache Wars had preceded him, and even hardened killers paused when facing a legendary strategist. Inside the Silver Lady Saloon, Kate Sullivan watched the scene unfold with growing understanding. Every renovation Harrison had suggested over the past months suddenly revealed its true purpose. The adjusted window heights offered perfect coverage while appearing decorative. The new support posts provided both protection and predetermined firing lanes. Crafty bastard, she whispered admiringly. He's turned my whole saloon into a fortress without anyone noticing. Dr. Chen, organizing her medical supplies, recalled Harrison's words from months ago. In battle, as in medicine, proper preparation can prevent the need for drastic measures. The morning's confrontation had revealed more than just Harrison's military background. It demonstrated that Silver Gulch itself had been transformed into an elaborate strategic position, though few understood the full scope of the Carpenters. Your preparations. Luke Morrison wheeled his horse, his face twisted with frustrated rage. This ain't over, strategist. Brother's bringing enough men to overwhelm any defenses you've rigged. By sunset, we'll see what your carpentry tricks are worth. Against real firepower. Perhaps, Harrison replied, his voice carrying that same precise measurement he used in his craft. You should consider that visible defenses aren't always the most crucial ones. In strategy, as in woodworking, the strongest joints are often hidden from view. As Morrison's advance guard withdrew, old Samuel hobbled over to Harrison's workshop. They'll be back, the former scout warned. Main force is gathering in Shadow Canyon. 30 riders at least, all professional gunmen. Harrison nodded, returning to his workbench where an unfinished project waited. Good. They're positioning exactly where we anticipated. Like wood grain, human nature follows predictable patterns, if you know how to read them. Robert, watching his mentor resume work on what appeared to be simple furniture, finally understood the deeper meaning behind all those lessons about planning, measurement, and precision. Every stroke of Harrison's tools served multiple purposes, just as every defensive position he'd created contained layers of strategic depth. Sir, the apprentice ventured, all those times you taught me about reading grain patterns and stress points, you weren't just talking about woodworking, were you? Harrison's hands never paused in their precise movements. Everything I've taught you about carpentry applies to strategy, Robert. understanding materials, calculating angles, anticipating how pressure will affect different points of contact. The principles remain the same whether you're crafting a dovetail joint or planning a defense. The morning's encounter had changed something in Silver Gulch. The townsfolk who had once mocked the methodical Carpenter now watched him with new eyes, beginning to understand that his careful measurements and precise calculations served a purpose, far beyond mere woodworking. As the sun climbed higher, Harrison's workshop continued its transformation. Simple barricades revealed hidden firing positions. Ordinary furniture concealed weapon caches. Each piece of his craft contributed to a larger design, one that would soon prove that the deadliest strategist isn't always the one who looks most dangerous. Deputy Wilson entered the workshop, his young face tight with concern. "Just got word from the telegraph office. The Phantom's reputation is growing. 3 more towns hit on their way here. Each one had strong defenses, each one fell." Harrison's hands moved steadily as he worked on what appeared to be decorative wall panels. "Tell me about their defensive positions." "Standard fortifications, barricades, gun ports, elevated positions. Everything by the book, exactly by the book," Harrison nodded, "which makes them predictable. Conventional defenses invite conventional attacks. But unconventional preparations," he gestured to his seemingly simple woodwork, "they create uncertainty. Uncertainty breeds hesitation. Hesitation costs time. And in strategy, timing is everything." Kate Sullivan burst in, her usual calm shattered. "One of my girls overheard Reynolds' men. They're planning to use the mine shafts to bypass our defenses. They think they know all the tunnel layouts." A ghost of a smile touched Harrison's lips. "They know what they're meant to know. Remember those support beams I insisted on replacing last month? Each one is more than just structural reinforcement." Understanding dawned in Kate's eyes. "The new timber placement, you've changed the viable routes through the mines. A maze is most effective when the walls appear to be exactly where they're expected," Harrison confirmed, testing the balance of another wooden dowel. "Though I suspect they'll find the underground routes less advantageous than they imagine." Dr. Chen, who had been organizing medical supplies near the window, suddenly stiffened. "Riders coming in from the east. Different groups this time. They're carrying explosives." Harrison moved to observe those craftsmen's hands, automatically checking the specialized tools at his belt. "Ah, the Phantom's demolition experts. Right on schedule." "Schedule?" Robert looked up from his work. "You expected this?" In warfare, as in woodworking, understanding your opponent's methodology is crucial. The Phantom always follows the same pattern: scouts, advance guard, demolition team, main force. Each move telegraphed by the previous one, like grain patterns revealing where wood will split. Outside, the new arrivals made their way toward the broken pine, where Reynolds held court. Harrison's keen eye noted their specialized equipment, the way they studied building foundations and support structures. "Sir," Robert ventured, "all those repairs you insisted on doing to the bank's foundation—" "Load-bearing points are fascinating things," Harrison replied, adjusting his spectacles. "Pressure applied to the wrong spot can bring down a building. But pressure applied to the right spot—" He paused, checking a measurement. "Well, let's just say some demolition experts might find their calculations need revision." Old Samuel watched from his corner, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup. "Reminds me of Skeleton Canyon," he mused. "Way you positioned those cavalry units made the bandits think they knew exactly where our weak points were." "The most effective trap," Harrison commented, "is one the enemy springs on himself, thinking he's exploiting your vulnerability." As afternoon approached, more pieces of Harrison's elaborate strategy revealed themselves to those who knew where to look. The seemingly random placement of new hitching posts created natural choke points. Renovated storefronts concealed carefully. Planned crossfire positions. Even the town's water supply had been subtly rerouted, though few understood why. Everything serves multiple purposes, Harrison explained to Robert as they worked. A support beam bears weight, yes, but positioned correctly, it also channels movement, creates cover, defines fields of fire. In strategy, as in craftsmanship, efficiency comes from making each element serve multiple functions. Kate Sullivan, watching another group of Reynolds men take up positions around town, noticed something peculiar. They're avoiding certain spots, she observed, places that look like natural defensive positions. Because those positions appear too obvious, Harrison replied. They suspect a trap, so they choose what seem like riskier locations, exactly where we want them. Midday brought the sound of explosions from the abandoned silver mines north of town. The Phantom's demolition team had begun their work, though not with the results they'd anticipated. Each blast revealed more about Harrison's intricate preparations than it disrupted them. Third tunnel collapse in 2 hours, Deputy Wilson reported, rushing into the workshop. They're trying to clear new routes through the old workings, but something's wrong. Every shaft they open seems to lead them exactly where they don't want to go. Harrison continued shaping a peculiar series of wooden wedges, each cut to precise angles. Interesting how old support beams fail, isn't it? Almost as if the ground itself remembers where it wants to break. Kate Sullivan entered, dust coating her usual elegant attire. Their demolition expert is furious, claims the tunnel. Layout doesn't match any of their maps. Keeps muttering about impossible angles and altered support structures. Geometry is unforgiving, Harrison replied, testing one of his wooden wedges against a beam, especially when it's been quietly adjusted over 6 months of routine maintenance work. The sound of gunfire erupted from the south end of town, Reynolds' men testing the defenses Harrison had established. But instead of finding vulnerable positions, they encountered a carefully orchestrated series of complications. Remarkable, Dr. Chen observed from the workshop window. Every shot they fire seems to ricochet exactly where you predicted. Those wooden barriers aren't just deflecting bullets, they're channeling them. Harrison adjusted his spectacles, studying the scene with a craftsman's attention to detail. Ballistics follow predictable paths. Like wood grain, once you understand the underlying patterns, you can guide them where you need them to go. A new figure appeared in the workshop doorway, James Ironjack Martinez, the demolition expert renowned across 3 territories. His face showed a professional's grudging respect. Been doing this work 15 years, he announced without preamble. Never seen anything like those mine supports. Every blast we set either collapses exactly the wrong tunnel or opens up a shaft that leads nowhere, almost like the entire mine system has been restructured. Harrison suggested mildly. Fascinating how geological pressure points work. Isn't it rather similar to stress points in timber? Ironjack's eyes narrowed. You're him, aren't you? The ghost colonel from Skeleton Canyon, the one who turned an entire mountain pass into a trap. I'm a carpenter, Harrison replied, his hands never pausing in their work. Though I find that principles of strategic planning apply surprisingly well to both military operations and woodworking. The demolition expert's hand dropped to his gun, but Harrison's movement was almost too subtle to follow. A wooden dowel seemed to materialize in the weapon's mechanism, jamming it with scientific precision. Fascinating thing about black powder, Harrison commented, returning to his work. Highly effective when properly contained, but useless when the pressure has nowhere to go. Rather like trying to force a solution instead of understanding the problem's true nature. Ironjack stared at his disabled weapon, then at the seemingly simple carpenter who had neutralized it with a piece of wood. Without another word, he turned and left the workshop. He'll warn the others, Robert said nervously. Of course, that's rather the point. In strategy, as in craftsmanship, sometimes the most effective tool is uncertainty. Every professional who encounters our preparations and lives to report back adds to the Phantom's hesitation. The afternoon brought new developments. Reynolds' men had discovered that their usual tactical positions around town had been subtly altered. Windows that should have provided perfect sniper posts were now at awkward angles. Alleyways that seemed to offer covered approaches led to unexpected dead ends. 6 months of renovation work, Kate Sullivan mused, watching another group of gunmen retreat from a carefully engineered kill zone. Every repair job, every improvement, you were really building a fortress in plain sight. Harrison's hands moved steadily as he worked on what appeared to be ordinary door frames. A fortress is obvious. It invites direct assault. This is something else entirely, a systematic manipulation of space and expectation. Dr. Chen, tending to a man wounded by one of the ricochet shots, noticed something peculiar about the town's transformation. The defenses aren't just physical, are they? You're attacking their methodology, their entire approach to violence. The strongest defense, Harrison replied, isn't the one that stops an attack, but the one that makes the enemy question his own tactics. Every failed approach, every unexpected complication, erodes their confidence in conventional solutions. The day wore on, and more of Harrison's preparations revealed their true nature. The relocated water barrels weren't just emergency supplies. They created sophisticated kill zones while appearing to be simple town improvements. The new hitching posts weren't just for horses. They channeled movement through predetermined paths while seeming randomly placed. Even the town's new street lamps, installed over months of careful planning, served multiple purposes. Their positioning created shadows exactly where Harrison needed them, turning familiar spaces into uncertainty zones after dark. "Remember what I taught you about joint stress?" Harrison told Robert as they worked. "How pressure applied to one point affects the entire structure? The same principle applies to strategic defense. Every position we control limits their options, forcing them to move exactly where we want them." A messenger arrived from Shadow Canyon. The Phantom's main force was gathering, but something had changed. The notorious outlaw leader was taking longer than expected, spending hours studying reports from his advanced teams. "Good," Harrison commented, examining a peculiar wooden contraption. "He remembers Skeleton Canyon. Remember how certainty became confusion, how every obvious solution led to carefully planned complications. They're saying he's brought explosives enough to level half the town," the messenger added nervously. "Interesting choice," Harrison replied, "though he might find that demolition works rather differently when all the structural points have been precisely adjusted. Rather like trying to split wood against its grain, the force tends to follow unexpected paths." Dr. Chen watched from her makeshift clinic as another of Reynolds' men was brought in, his arm injured not by direct fire, but by a precisely calculated ricochet. These aren't random injuries, she realized. Every deflection, every rebound, they're all designed to disable rather than kill. "A craftsman chooses his tools based on the work required," Harrison commented, examining a new series of wooden implements. "Sometimes a lighter touch achieves more lasting results than brute force." The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor, Widow Parker, her usually stern face showing concern. "They're watching my root cellar," she reported. "Just like you said. They would. 3 men posted in the shadows, thinking they're being clever." Harrison nodded, his hands testing the balance of a newly crafted wooden mechanism. "And the special modifications we made last month? Working perfectly. They're so focused on the obvious entrance, they haven't noticed the changes to the foundation stones, though I still don't understand why you insisted on those peculiar angles in the new support beams. In strategy, as in architecture, true, strength often lies in unexpected places. They're watching your cellar because it's where they expect us to hide valuables. Meanwhile, the real shelter beneath the church remains undetected," she finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. "You're not just defending the town, you're choreographing their entire approach. As evening shadows began to lengthen, more of Harrison's intricate preparations revealed themselves. The new church bell tower, recently reinforced with his specially treated timber, offered commanding views while appearing purely decorative. The rebuilt stable doors contained hidden positions that could control entire sections of the street. Like a master chess player, old Samuel observed, watching another group of gunmen retreat from a carefully engineered dead end. Setting up pieces days, weeks, months in advance. By the time your opponent realizes the game's true nature, it's already been decided. Harrison finished adjusting his spectacles. Though the Phantom might remember similar principles from our last encounter, strategy isn't about the obvious moves. It's about creating situations where every apparent solution leads exactly where you need it to go. The sun began its descent behind Devil's Backbone Ridge, painting the town in shades of amber and shadow. Harrison's workshop had become a hub of focused activity, though few understood the true significance of the items he crafted. Notice how each piece serves multiple functions, he explained to Robert, demonstrating a peculiar wooden mechanism. Like this joint, appears decorative, but under specific pressure. The seemingly simple construction revealed a complex series of interlocking components. Just like the town itself, the apprentice realized. Everything you've built, every repair, every improvement, they all work together in ways that aren't obvious until they're needed. Precisely. The strongest defense isn't a wall or a barricade. It's an interconnected system where each element supports the others, creating a whole greater than its parts. As night approached, Silver Gulch prepared for what everyone knew would be a decisive confrontation. But thanks to Harrison's meticulous planning, the town itself had become more than just a battlefield. It was an intricate mechanism waiting to be activated, every component carefully crafted and positioned for maximum effect. The question wasn't whether the Phantom would attack, but whether he would realize the true nature of what he faced before it was too late. After all, as Harrison often said, the most effective strategy isn't the one that looks most impressive, but the one that's so subtly crafted that your opponent doesn't realize its full scope until they're already caught within its design. Night fell over Silver Gulch like a velvet curtain, but the darkness brought no peace. The Phantom's main force had arrived, 50 riders materializing from the shadows like wraiths. Their leader, James Morrison, sat his horse at the edge of town, his signature silver mask catching the moonlight. "Quite the reception you've prepared." "Colonel," Morrison called out, his voice carrying the same calculated precision Harrison remembered from Skeleton Canyon. "Or should I say, Carpenter, your renovations are impressive, almost as elegant as that mountain trap you built for us." Harrison emerged from his workshop, those craftsman's hands hanging loose at his sides. In the moonlight, his wire-rimmed spectacles reflected like twin moons. "Mr. Morrison, I see you've brought more men than last time." "Had to," the Phantom replied, gesturing to the town's carefully engineered defenses. 6 months of watching you work, studying every change, every improvement. You've turned this whole town into one of your famous tactical puzzles. Just like Skeleton Canyon." "Interesting comparison," Harrison adjusted his glasses. "Though you might find woodworking offers different lessons than military strategy." Morrison's laugh held no humor. "Still playing the humble craftsman? Your carpentry skills might fool others, but I remember 3 regiments of cavalry appearing from impossible angles. Every escape route turned into a trap. Lost 30 men without a single shot fired. Around them, the Phantom's men had begun taking positions, though Harrison noted their hesitation. Every seemingly advantageous spot held hidden complications. Every apparent weakness masked carefully planned countermeasures. "Your demolition team seems frustrated," Harrison observed mildly. "Having trouble with the mine tunnels?" Morrison's hand tightened on his reins. Those support beams, load-bearing points adjusted by fractions of an inch. Every blast either collapses the wrong tunnel or opens into a prepared kill zone. Took me 3 hours to realize you weren't just repairing the mines. You were redesigning their entire structure. A carpenter must understand structural principles, Harrison replied, his voice carrying the same precision he brought to his measurements. How pressure affects different materials, how force flows through connected points. Enough games. The Phantom's voice hardened. You've had 6 months to prepare your tricks. I've brought enough men and explosives to level this entire town. No amount of clever carpentry can stop that kind of force. Harrison's smile was barely visible in the moonlight. Interesting assumption, though you might recall from our last encounter, sometimes the most effective force isn't the most obvious one. As if to prove his point, several of Morrison's men suddenly found their positions compromised. The seemingly solid cover they'd chosen revealed unexpected angles of exposure. Firing lanes they'd counted on proved to be carefully engineered dead ends. "Notice how your men keep shifting position?" Harrison asked. "Every time they think they've found a tactical advantage, they discover the ground itself seems to work against them, rather like trying to split wood against its grain." Kate Sullivan, watching from her strategically modified saloon, saw what others missed. The Phantom's forces, despite their numbers, couldn't establish effective control. Every standard tactical approach had been subtly undermined by months of careful preparation. "It's like watching a master puppeteer," she whispered to Dr. Chen. "He's choreographing their entire deployment without seeming to move at all." The town's newly installed street lamps cast strategic pools of light and shadow, creating zones of uncertainty that forced Morrison's men to cluster in predictable patterns. Even the hitching posts, carefully repositioned over months of routine maintenance, channeled movement along predetermined paths. "Your reputation grown, Colonel," Morrison called out, frustration evident in his voice. 3 towns we hit on the way here, each one following standard defensive tactics. But this," he gestured to the intricate web of prepared positions and engineered angles, "this is something else entirely. Amazing what you can accomplish with proper planning and precise measurements," Harrison replied, "though I suspect you're more interested in the principles behind the preparation than the carpentry itself." The Phantom's silver mask caught moonlight as he turned to study the town's layout. "Each change you made, every repair and improvement, they're all connected, aren't they? Like pieces of some massive mechanical trap, joints in a larger structure," Harrison corrected. "Each element supports the others, creating a unified whole, rather like a well-crafted piece of furniture." Morrison's laugh was harsh. "Still playing the humble woodworker? Your men are dead or in prison, Colonel. Your military career ended in disgrace. Yet here you are, building elaborate tactical systems disguised as simple carpentry." "You misunderstand." Harrison's hands moved with practiced care as he examined a wooden dowel. "I'm not disguising anything. The principles remain the same, whether you're crafting a dovetail joint or organizing a defense. Understanding materials, calculating pressure points, anticipating how force flows through connected elements." Around them, the Phantom's men continued their cautious deployment, but each position they occupied seemed to reveal new complications. Sniper posts offered compromised fields of fire. Covered approaches led to carefully engineered kill zones. Even the town's water barrels had been positioned to create strategic choke points while appearing randomly placed. "Your men are getting frustrated," Harrison observed, noting the increasing tension among Morrison's forces. "Finding that conventional tactics don't quite work as expected when the battlefield itself has been redesigned." The Phantom dismounted, his silver mask gleaming as he studied the town's layout with professional attention. "These positions, they're not just defenses, they're a psychological trap. Every time my men think they've found advantage, they discover some subtle complication that makes them question their own judgment. Rather like a complex joint, Harrison replied, demonstrating with a piece of wood from his pocket. Appears simple on the surface, but the real strength lies in how the pieces interact. Enough, Morrison's patience snapped. Luke, show our carpenter friend what happens to his clever preparations when we apply enough force. Luke Morrison stepped forward, raising a signal lantern. In response, multiple explosions rocked the outer buildings, but instead of creating chaos, the blasts revealed more layers of Harrison's intricate planning. Fascinating thing about structural engineering, Harrison commented as dust settled. Force doesn't always flow where you expect it to, rather like water finding its own path. The explosions had indeed changed the battlefield, but not as the Phantom's men had intended. Collapsed walls created new firing lanes that favored the defenders. Destroyed barricades revealed secondary positions that had been hidden within. Seemingly solid structures. You built fail-safes into the buildings themselves, Morrison realized, professional admiration creeping into his voice. Every point of apparent weakness engineered to reveal new defensive positions when compromised. A good craftsman always plans for stress points, Harrison replied, though I suspect you're more interested in how this applies to tactical situations than woodworking, Kate Sullivan's voice carried from her fortified saloon. Harrison, they're trying to flank through the alleys behind the bank. Ah, yes. Harrison adjusted his spectacles. I was wondering when they'd discover those passages. Rather interesting how narrow spaces affect movement patterns, isn't it? The sounds of confusion erupted from the alleyways as the Phantom's flanking force encountered yet another carefully prepared surprise. The passages, subtly redesigned over months of routine maintenance, had become a maze of engineered choke points and dead ends. Your reputation for tactical brilliance was well earned. Colonel, Morrison called out, frustration evident in his voice. But even you can't prepare for everything. I've got 50 men and enough explosives to turn this whole town into kindling. Harrison's response was to demonstrate another of his wooden mechanisms, a simple lever that, when activated, caused a series of seemingly decorative timber supports to shift, revealing previously hidden defensive positions throughout the town square. Tell me, Mr. Morrison, he said quietly, in all your study of my preparations, did you ever consider that the obvious defenses might be less important than the principles behind them? The night air grew tense as the Phantom realized the true nature of what he faced. This wasn't just a defended town, it was a masterpiece of tactical engineering disguised as simple carpentry, where every beam and board had been placed with mathematical precision to create an interlocking system. Of strategic advantage, the first shot came from Reynolds' men, shattering the tense standoff. But instead of finding its mark, the bullet ricocheted off one of Harrison's carefully angled wooden barriers, setting off a chain reaction of precisely calculated deflections that disarmed 3 of Morrison's gunmen without drawing blood. Remarkable, the Phantom observed, his silver mask catching moonlight. You've turned the entire town square into a ballistic equation. Every surface is calculated to redirect force rather than absorb it. Harrison's hands moved with fluid precision as he activated another of his wooden mechanisms. Physics applies to bullets just as it does to wood grain. Understanding flow patterns is essential in both crafts. Morrison's response was immediate and violent. On his signal, multiple explosions rocked the town's perimeter, aimed at what his demolition experts had identified as crucial support points. But as the dust settled, a new pattern emerged, one that made even the hardened outlaw leader pause. Those weren't just support beams, Iron Jack called out, professional awe in his voice. Each explosion has revealed secondary positions, turning our own force against us. It's like the whole town is some kind of mechanical puzzle. A matter of understanding stress points, Harrison replied, adjusting his spectacles. Though I suspect you're discovering that demolition principles work differently when the target area has been systematically redesigned. Around them, the Phantom's men found themselves caught in an elaborate tactical web. Every attempt to establish dominant positions led them into carefully prepared kill zones. Each effort to flank the defenders revealed new complications in the town's modified layout. Kate Sullivan watched from her fortified saloon as three of Morrison's best gunmen tried to set up a crossfire position. Instead, they found themselves exposed by Harrison's precisely arranged street lamps and architectural modifications. "Like watching a master chess player," she murmured to Dr. Chen. "He's not just predicting their moves, he's designed the entire board to make certain moves inevitable." The Phantom's tactical genius showed in his quick appreciation of the situation. "The carpentry was never just a cover," he called out. "You've turned craft principles into military strategy. Every repair, every renovation, they're all part of the larger tactical system." "Interesting observation," Harrison replied, his hand steady as he examined another of his wooden implements. "Though you might consider that military strategy and craftsmanship share fundamental principles. Both require understanding materials, calculating pressures, and anticipating how force flows through connected points." Morrison's response was to signal his demolition team to target the town's water supply. But as they moved into position, Harrison activated another of his carefully prepared mechanisms. The seemingly decorative wooden frames around the water tower revealed hidden compartments, dropping precisely cut timbers that created new defensive positions while blocking the attacker's approach. "You've had 6 months to prepare," the Phantom acknowledged, studying the evolving battlefield. "But even you can't account for every possibility." Harrison's smile was barely visible in the moonlight. A master craftsman doesn't try to predict every outcome. He creates systems that turn any outcome to advantage. The night air crackled with tension as Morrison's men attempted increasingly desperate tactics. They tried setting fires, only to find that Harrison's modified water barrel positions created natural fire breaks while channeling flames away from crucial structures. They attempted to use the town's horses for cover, but discovered that the newly positioned hitching posts formed elaborate corridors that exposed any mounted approach. "Your men are starting to understand," Harrison observed quietly. "Each obvious solution reveals new complications. Each straightforward approach leads to carefully engineered disadvantages." The Phantom's tactical mind had finally grasped the full scope of what he faced. This isn't just defense, it's psychological warfare built into the town's very structure. Every failure makes my men question their next move and hesitate when they should act. "Rather like wood grain affecting a cut," Harrison replied, demonstrating with a piece of timber. "Force applied against the natural pattern tends to produce unexpected results." Dr. Chen, tending to minor injuries from ricocheted bullets, noticed something remarkable. "Every wound is non-lethal," she reported. "Your calculations aren't just about deflecting bullets, you're controlling exactly how much force reaches any target." "Precision matters in all things," Harrison answered, his craftsman's hands checking another wooden mechanism. "Whether shaping wood or directing combat, the goal is to achieve maximum effect with minimum waste." Morrison's frustration mounted as more of his carefully planned attacks dissolved into confusion. His men, professionals who had participated in dozens of town raids, found their experience working against them. Every standard tactic had been anticipated and countered through subtle modifications to the battlefield itself. Testing the south. "Barricades!" Luke Morrison's voice carried across the square. A new wave of attackers surged forward, only to find themselves caught in another of Harrison's elaborate tactical designs. "Notice how the barricades appear simple," Harrison commented to Robert, who had stayed by his mentor's side. "But under pressure, they reveal additional complexities. As if to demonstrate, the wooden structures shifted under impact, creating new firing lanes while exposing the attackers to precise counterfire. Kate Sullivan had positioned her best shooters according to Harrison's instructions. "They're starting to break formation," she reported. "Every time they think they've found a pattern, your defenses change configuration." The Phantom's tactical mind was working furiously, trying to decode the principles behind Harrison's system. "The whole town's like one of your military exercises," he called out. "Every element connected, each piece supporting the others, but there has to be a weak point." "Interesting assumption," Harrison replied, activating another of his wooden mechanisms. "Though you might consider that in both strategy and craftsmanship, apparent weakness often masks underlying strength." A series of explosions rocked the north end of town, Morrison's demolition team attempting to create new approaches through the buildings themselves. But as walls crumbled, Harrison's secondary defenses emerged, turning the rubble into pre-calculated firing positions. "Impossible," Iron Jack muttered, watching his explosives achieve exactly the opposite of their intended effect. "He's not just using the buildings for cover. He's designed them to become more defensible when damaged." Dr. Chin, who had set up multiple aid stations according to Harrison's plans, saw the pattern emerging. "You're not just defending," she realized. "You're guiding them, using their own tactics to reshape the battlefield." Rather like river water, Harrison nodded, adjusting his spectacles. "Force flows naturally along certain paths. Understanding those paths allows you to direct that force where it's most useful." The night wore on, and the Phantom's men found themselves increasingly disoriented. Every standard approach revealed new complications. Each tactical adjustment seemed to play directly into Harrison's prepared responses. "Your reputation in the Apache Wars," Morrison called out, studying the evolving battlefield. "The stories about impossible victories, battles won without casualties. They weren't exaggerations, were they?" Harrison's hands moved with precise care as he adjusted another of his wooden implements. "Military strategy, like fine craftsmanship, benefits from careful preparation and precise execution, though I find woodworking considerably more satisfying." The town's transformation continued as more of Harrison's preparations revealed themselves. Buildings that appeared vulnerable became strong points when attacked from certain angles. Alleyways that seemed to offer safe passage turned into elaborate, tactical puzzles. "It's not just about the physical defenses," old Samuel observed from his position near the workshop. "You're attacking their whole approach to violence, making them question every move, doubt every decision." "The strongest defense," Harrison replied, "is one that makes force counterproductive, rather like working with wood grain instead of against it." Midnight brought a new phase to the battle for Silver Gulch. The Phantom, realizing conventional tactics had failed, unveiled his master plan. From the shadows emerged specialized equipment, mobile artillery pieces that his men had been secretly positioning while testing the town's defenses. "Let's see how your wooden barriers handle grape shot, Colonel," Morrison called out, his silver mask gleaming in the moonlight. "No amount of clever carpentry can stop that kind of firepower." Harrison studied the artillery positions through his wire-rimmed spectacles, those craftsman's hands automatically calculating angles and trajectories. "Interesting choice of weapons, though you might find ballistics behave differently when the environment has been precisely calibrated." The first cannon roared to life, its grape shot spreading in a deadly pattern, only to encounter Harrison's most sophisticated defense yet. The supposedly decorative wooden archways he'd installed throughout town suddenly revealed their true purpose, their precisely angled surfaces splitting and redirecting the shot pattern. "Remarkable," Iron Jack breathed, watching the artillery's effectiveness dissolve. He's created deflection matrices disguised as ordinary construction. The shot patterns are being broken up and channeled away from vital positions. The Phantom's tactical mind quickly grasped the implications. Those aren't just defensive structures, they're part of a larger ballistic equation. Every surface, every angle is calculated to handle specific types of attacks, rather like designing furniture. To handle different stress loads, Harrison replied, activating another of his wooden mechanisms. Understanding force distribution is crucial in both crafts. Kate Sullivan watched from her fortified position as Morrison's artillery gambit backfired spectacularly. The carefully positioned cannons found themselves in precisely engineered kill zones, their crews unable to adjust or retreat effectively. "Your men are starting to understand," she called out to Harrison. "This isn't just about stopping attacks. It's about making certain strategies impossible to execute." Morrison's response was to order his demolition team to target the town's structural supports directly. "Bring it all down," he commanded. "See how his precious calculations work when the whole battlefield collapses." But as the explosions rocked Silver Gulch, Harrison's most elaborate preparations revealed themselves. Buildings didn't collapse, they transformed. Load-bearing points, adjusted over months of careful work, caused structures to fall in precisely calculated patterns, creating new defensive positions while eliminating attack routes. "You've turned the entire town into a mechanical puzzle," the Phantom realized, professional admiration creeping into his voice. "Every piece interconnected, each failure point engineered to create new advantages." Harrison's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he adjusted another of his wooden implements. In both military strategy and craftsmanship, understanding failure points is essential, though I find wood more predictable than human nature. Dr. Chen, watching from her multiple aid stations, noticed a pattern in Harrison's defense. "You're not just protecting positions," she observed. "You're systematically eliminating their tactical options, forcing them to abandon conventional warfare entirely." "The strongest defense," Harrison replied, "isn't the one that stops attacks, but the one that makes attacking itself counterproductive. Rather like wood grain, guiding a cut instead of resisting it. Morrison's men, professional killers who had terrorized 3 territories, found themselves increasingly hesitant to act. Every standard tactic they attempted not only failed, but seemed to strengthen the town's defensive position. Each new strategy they employed revealed more layers of Harrison's intricate planning. "Your Apache War's reputation," the Phantom called out, studying the evolving battlefield. "They said you could turn any terrain into an unwinnable scenario. Called you the Ghost Colonel because you could defeat enemies without ever engaging directly." Harrison's response was to demonstrate another of his wooden mechanisms, a series of interlocked timbers that, when activated, completely changed the tactical layout of the town square. "Military strategy benefits from understanding natural principles," he commented. "Force, like wood grain, follows predictable patterns if you know how to read them." Young Robert, still at his mentor's side, watched in amazement as more of Harrison's preparations revealed their true sophistication. The town's transformation wasn't just physical, it was psychological, turning each of the Phantom's tactical advantages into subtle traps. "They're breaking formation in the east sector," Kate Sullivan reported. 3 more men just surrendered after their positions became untenable. The Phantom's response was swift and desperate. "Bring up the heavy charges," he commanded. "Target the foundation points Iron Jack identified." But as his demolition team moved into position, Harrison activated what appeared to be simple, decorative trim along the buildings. The wooden elements shifted, revealing carefully engineered firing, ports that covered every approach to the crucial structural points. "Notice how they've stopped using standard tactics," Harrison commented to Dr. Chen as she treated a minor wound on his arm. "They're learning that conventional warfare becomes impossible when the battlefield itself rejects violence." Morrison's tactical genius showed in his growing understanding of the situation. "It's not just about defense," he called out. "You've created a system that turns aggression itself into a disadvantage. Every attack we launch strengthens your position." "Rather like certain types of joinery," Harrison replied, adjusting his spectacles. "The more pressure applied, the stronger the bond becomes." The night had become a masterclass in strategic warfare, though few recognized it as such. Harrison's carefully engineered town wasn't just defeating the Phantom's gang, it was systematically dismantling their entire approach to violence. "Your Apache War's strategies," Morrison observed, watching another of his tactical positions become compromised. "They weren't about direct confrontation at all, were they? You won by making conventional warfare impossible." Harrison's hands moved with practiced precision as he adjusted another of his wooden mechanisms. Military strategy, like fine craftsmanship, benefits from understanding fundamental principles. The strongest joint isn't the one that resists force. It's the one that redirects it usefully. As midnight deepened toward dawn, the Phantom's men found themselves caught in an increasingly sophisticated trap. Every position they abandoned became a new defensive strongpoint. Each failed attack revealed another layer of Harrison's intricate planning. "It's like watching a master weaver," old Samuel commented, observing from his position near the workshop. "Every thread they pull just tightens the pattern around them." The pre-dawn hours brought a chilling revelation to the Phantom's forces. Morrison, studying the battlefield through his specialized field glasses, finally understood the true magnitude of Harrison's strategy. Each failed attack, every thwarted plan had been systematically channeling his men into increasingly untenable positions. "Your workshop," he called out, genuine admiration mixing with frustration. "It's not just a base of operations, is it? It's the control center for this entire mechanical masterpiece." Harrison's hands moved with fluid precision as he activated another wooden mechanism. A craftsman's workshop reflects his understanding of materials and methods, though some principles apply beyond mere woodworking. The Phantom's response was his most audacious gambit yet. "Target the Carpenter's shop," he commanded. "Everything centers on that position. Bring it down, and his whole system collapses." But as his men moved to attack, Harrison's most sophisticated preparations revealed themselves. The workshop's seemingly simple structure transformed, wooden panels sliding and rotating to create an interlocking series of defensive positions. "Fascinating thing about load-bearing points," Harrison commented, adjusting his spectacles. "Proper understanding allows you to distribute force exactly where it's most useful." Kate Sullivan, watching from her strategic position, saw the pattern emerge. The workshop wasn't just your base, she realized. It's a demonstration piece, showing them exactly what they're facing throughout the entire town. Morrison's tactical mind grasped the implications quickly. Every building, every structure, they're all capable of similar transformations. We're not fighting in a town, we're trapped inside a giant mechanical puzzle. "Rather like a complex joint," Harrison replied, demonstrating with one of his wooden implements. "Each element supports the others, creating a system stronger than its individual components." The Phantom's men, hardened killers who had terrorized 3 territories, found themselves increasingly hesitant to act. Every position they occupied seemed to work against them. Each tactical adjustment revealed new layers of Harrison's intricate planning. "Your Apache War's strategies," Morrison called out, studying the evolving battlefield. The stories about bloodless victories, about entire enemy forces surrendering without a shot fired. They weren't just legends, were they? Harrison's response was to activate another of his carefully prepared mechanisms. The town's newly installed street lamps shifted, their light creating strategic shadows that forced the Phantom's men to cluster in predictable patterns. "Military strategy," he replied, "like fine craftsmanship, benefits from understanding fundamental principles. Sometimes the most effective force isn't the one that destroys, but the one that guides." Dr. Chen, moving between her aid stations, noticed something remarkable about Harrison's defense. "You're not just protecting the town," she observed. "You're systematically dismantling their ability to use violence effectively." "Violence," Harrison responded, his hands steady as he worked another wooden mechanism. "Like any force, follows predictable patterns. Understanding those patterns allows you to redirect them constructively." The Phantom's frustration mounted as more of his carefully planned attacks dissolved into confusion. His men, professionals who had participated in dozens of successful raids, found their experience becoming a liability. Every standard tactic they attempted seemed to strengthen Harrison's position. "You've turned the entire town into a lesson," Morrison realized, watching another group of his men surrender after finding themselves in an impossible position. "Every failed attack, every thwarted plan teaches my men the futility of their approach." Harrison activated another series of wooden mechanisms, transforming 3 different sections of the town simultaneously. Education often comes from experience rather than instruction. The Phantom's remaining forces found themselves caught in an elaborate tactical web that seemed to anticipate and counter their every move. Even their most experienced fighters began showing signs of uncertainty, their confidence eroded by Harrison's systematic dismantling of their combat methodology. "The reinforced bank windows," Iron Jack called out, studying the structures with professional interest. "They're not just bulletproof. They're designed to reflect shots back at specific angles, like a complex mirror system, but with lethal precision." "Material properties are fascinating things," Harrison replied, adjusting his spectacles. "Whether wood or metal, understanding how they react under pressure allows for precise control of outcomes." Kate Sullivan, who had been keeping count, reported another significant development. 15 more surrendered in the last hour. "They're saying it's impossible to fight against a town that thinks 3 moves ahead." Morrison's tactical genius showed in his growing comprehension of the full scope of Harrison's strategy. "This isn't just about defending the town," he called out. "You're rewriting the rules of engagement itself, making us question every basic assumption about how combat works." "Rather like teaching apprentices about wood grain," Harrison responded, demonstrating with a piece of timber. "Sometimes, understanding why certain approaches fail is more valuable than learning new techniques." The pre-dawn light revealed more of Harrison's intricate preparations. Buildings that had appeared vulnerable demonstrated sophisticated defensive and capabilities. Streets that seemed to offer tactical advantage became elaborate traps for unwary attackers. "You've created something entirely new here," the Phantom observed, his silver mask catching the first hints of dawn. "A defense system that doesn't just stop attacks. It makes attackers question their entire approach to violence." "Innovation often comes from applying familiar principles in unexpected ways," Harrison replied, his hands steady as he worked. Another of his wooden mechanisms, "Though I find woodworking provides particularly useful insights into force and resistance." Dr. Chen, treating another of Morrison's men who had been disabled by a precisely calculated ricochet, noticed a pattern in the injuries. "Every wound is designed to incapacitate without killing," she realized. "You're not just defending the town, you're proving that lethal force isn't necessary for effective defense." The night's events had transformed Silver Gulch into more than just a battleground. It had become a demonstration of an entirely new approach to conflict resolution, where intelligence and precision systematically undermined the effectiveness of brute force. First light revealed the true extent of the Phantom's desperation. Morrison, his silver mask now dulled with dust and gunsmoke, unveiled his final gambit, a specialized weapon he'd saved for extreme situations. "Impressed by your strategic genius, Colonel," he called out, assembling the strange device. "But let's see how your wooden defenses handle Greek fire. Burns hot enough to turn this whole mechanical masterpiece into ash." Harrison studied the weapon through his wire-rimmed spectacles, those craftsman's hands automatically calculating new variables. Interesting choice, though you might consider how heat affects different materials under specific conditions. The Phantom's men began deploying the incendiary devices, but Harrison's response was immediate and precisely calculated. With a series of subtle adjustments to his wooden mechanisms, the town's water distribution system revealed its true sophistication. "Notice how the water barrels are positioned," he commented to Robert. "Not just for firefighting, but for creating specific pressure zones under emergency conditions." Morrison's attack began with a roar of flame, but each blast of Greek fire encountered Harrison's most elaborate defense yet: water streams activated at precise angles, creating overlapping zones of protection while channeling the burning liquid away from vulnerable structures. "Impossible," Iron Jack breathed, watching his specialized weapons rendered ineffective. He's calculated fluid dynamics into his defensive design. The water patterns aren't just stopping the fire, they're using its own force to protect the town. Kate Sullivan, observing from her strategic position, saw the pattern emerge. "The new gutters you installed last month," she called out. "They're not just for rain, are they?" "Water flow, like wood grain, follows predictable patterns," Harrison replied, activating another of his mechanisms. "Understanding those patterns allows for precise control under various conditions." The Phantom's tactical mind grasped the implications quickly. Even his most devastating weapon had been anticipated and countered through careful preparation and precise engineering. His men, watching their last advantage dissolve, began laying down their weapons. "Your reputation in the Apache Wars," Morrison called out, with genuine respect in his voice. "They said you could win battles without firing a shot. Said you understood strategy on a level that made conventional warfare obsolete." Harrison's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he adjusted another wooden mechanism. "Military strategy benefits from understanding fundamental principles. Sometimes the most effective defense isn't the one that destroys attacks, but the one that makes them counterproductive." Dr. Chen, watching from her aid station, noticed something remarkable about Harrison's water defense system. "You're not just stopping the fire," she observed. "You're creating safe zones, escape routes, and tactical advantages all at once." "Rather like a complex joint," Harrison replied, demonstrating with a piece of timber. "Each element serves multiple purposes, supporting the overall structure while providing specific benefits under different conditions." The dawn light revealed more of Harrison's intricate preparations. The town's transformation wasn't just defensive, it was a systematic demonstration of how precision and planning could overcome brute force. Each failed attack had taught the Phantom's men a lesson about the futility of violence against properly prepared positions. As the Greek fire attack faltered, Morrison made one final desperate attempt. "Luke, the special charges target the water system's control points." But Harrison's response demonstrated the true depth of his preparation. With 3 precise movements, he activated hidden mechanisms throughout the town. Wooden panels shifted, revealing secondary water distribution networks that had been concealed within seemingly solid walls. "Redundancy is crucial in both engineering and strategy," he commented, adjusting his spectacles, "though I find wood grain more predictable than human nature." The Phantom's remaining men watched in disbelief as their last tactical advantage dissolved. Even their specialized demolition charges proved ineffective against Harrison's layered defenses. "You've thought of everything," Morrison acknowledged, his silver mask catching the morning light. "Each counter we devise reveals another layer of your preparation. It's like playing chess against someone who designed the board itself." Chess is an interesting comparison, Harrison replied, his hands steady as he worked another mechanism. Though I prefer games where the pieces can be reshaped according to need. Kate Sullivan, who had witnessed the entire night's transformation, saw the final pattern emerge. The town isn't just defending itself, she called out. It's teaching them a new way of thinking about conflict. Harrison nodded, those craftsmen's hands moving with practiced precision. Understanding comes in many forms. Sometimes the most effective lesson is one that demonstrates rather than explains. The morning sun revealed the full extent of Harrison's strategic masterpiece. Not a single building had been destroyed, despite the Phantom's most determined efforts. Instead, each structure had demonstrated new capabilities under pressure, revealing layers of sophisticated engineering that turned attacks into advantages. In the Apache Wars, Morrison said quietly, studying the transformed battlefield, they called you the Ghost Colonel because you could defeat enemies without leaving traces of combat. But this is something entirely new. Innovation often comes from applying familiar principles in unexpected ways, Harrison responded, demonstrating with another of his wooden mechanisms. Though I find carpentry provides particularly useful insights into force and resistance. Dr. Chen, completing her rounds of the aid stations, made a remarkable observation. Not a single fatal injury, she reported. Every defensive measure is calculated to disable rather than destroy. You've created a new paradigm of protective strategy. The dawn's light painted Silver Gulch in shades of victory, but not the kind the Phantom's men were familiar with. This was a triumph of intelligence over force, of precision over violence, of careful preparation over brute strength. Morning light streamed through the dust-filled air of Silver Gulch, illuminating the aftermath of the Phantom's failed assault. Morrison stood in the town square, his silver mask removed, revealing a face marked by both exhaustion and dawning understanding. 50 men, he mused, surveying his disarmed forces. 50 experienced killers, neutralized without a single death. You've created something revolutionary here, Colonel. Harrison's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began dismantling some of his wooden mechanisms. Revolution often comes from understanding basic principles, whether in carpentry or combat. The key lies in working with natural forces rather than against them. The town's transformation had been completed. Every structure that the Phantom's men had targeted now demonstrated new capabilities, revealing layers of sophisticated engineering that had turned their own tactics against them. Your workshop, Iron Jack approached, professional curiosity, overwhelming his caution. Those weren't just tools you were crafting all these months. Each piece was part of a larger system, wasn't it? A craftsman's tools reflect his understanding of materials, Harrison replied, adjusting his spectacles, though some tools serve purposes beyond their apparent function. Kate Sullivan emerged from her fortified saloon, which had proven instrumental in Harrison's defense strategy. The renovations you suggested, she called out, every modification, every repair, they were all calculated to work together, weren't they? Rather like a complex piece of furniture, Harrison demonstrated, with a wooden joint. Each element supports the others, creating something greater than its individual parts. Dr. Chen, completing her final rounds, reported an unprecedented outcome. Not a single fatality, she announced. Every injury is precisely calculated to disable without permanent harm. You've revolutionized defensive warfare. The Phantom's tactical mind had finally grasped the full scope of Harrison's achievement. This goes beyond military strategy, he observed. You've created a system that makes violence itself ineffective. Every attack we launched only revealed more layers of your preparation. Young Robert, who had watched the entire night's transformation, began to understand the deeper lessons in his mentor's teachings. All those carpentry principles you taught me, he realized. They weren't just about woodworking, were they? Every craft contains fundamental truths, Harrison replied, his hands steady as he adjusted another mechanism. Understanding those truths allows for application in unexpected ways. Around them, the Phantom's men were surrendering their weapons, their professional pride replaced by genuine respect. They had encountered something entirely new, a defense system that didn't just stop attacks, but systematically demonstrated the futility of violent approaches. Your reputation from the Apache Wars, Morrison said quietly, about winning battles without bloodshed. This is how you did it, isn't it? Creating systems that make conventional warfare impossible. Harrison's response was to demonstrate one final aspect of his town's transformation. With a series of precise adjustments, the seemingly simple wooden structures began returning to their ordinary appearances, though now everyone understood their true capabilities. A master craftsman, he explained, doesn't just build things. He creates solutions that work with natural principles rather than against them. Iron Jack, still studying the town's transformed structures, noticed something remarkable. The way you positioned everything. It's not just about defense. Each element serves multiple purposes, creating layers of tactical advantage while appearing completely ordinary. Function often benefits from subtle design, Harrison replied, his hands moving with practiced precision as he adjusted another mechanism. Though I find carpentry provides particularly useful insights into the relationship between appearance and capability. The morning revealed more subtle aspects of Harrison's strategic mastery. The town's water distribution system, which had so effectively countered the Phantom's Greek fire, began quietly returning to its seemingly mundane purpose. But now everyone understood its true sophistication, like watching a master magician reveal his secrets, Kate Sullivan observed. Except instead of illusions, you've shown us how simple materials and careful planning can overcome any amount of brute force. Morrison, his legendary tactical mind still processing the night's lessons, approached Harrison's workshop. You've done more than just defend a town, he acknowledged. You've demonstrated an entirely new approach to conflict resolution. Every failed attack taught my men something about the futility of their methods. Harrison's response was to demonstrate another aspect of his workshop's transformation. The seemingly simple tools and workbenches revealed additional layers of tactical design, each element contributing to the town's integrated defense system. Notice how each piece serves multiple functions, he explained to Robert, who watched in fascination. Like a well-crafted joint, the strength comes from how the elements work together rather than individual components. Dr. Chen, completing her final analysis of the night's engagements, reported something unprecedented. Every defensive measure was calculated to exact specifications, she noted. Even the ricochets and deflections were precisely engineered to incapacitate without causing permanent harm. The Phantom's remaining men, professionals who had participated in countless successful raids, found themselves studying Harrison's methods with newfound respect. They had encountered something that challenged their entire understanding of combat and strategy. In the Apache Wars, old Samuel recalled, they said you could read terrain like others read books. But this is something different. You've turned an entire town into a living demonstration of strategic principles. As the morning sun climbed higher over Silver Gulch, word of Harrison's unprecedented victory began spreading throughout the territory. The territorial marshal himself arrived to witness the aftermath of a battle where strategic genius had systematically dismantled one of the West's most notorious gangs without bloodshed. Remarkable, Marshal Thompson observed, studying the transformed town. Reports said the Phantom's gang was neutralized by a carpenter using wooden mechanisms, but this is beyond anything in military history. Harrison continued his methodical work, those craftsmen's hands now engaged in restoring the town's ordinary appearance. Military strategy, like fine woodworking, benefits from understanding fundamental principles. The Marshal watched as another of Harrison's sophisticated defense systems quietly reverted to its seemingly mundane form. These aren't just tactical innovations, he realized. You've created an entirely new approach to law enforcement, rather like designing furniture, Harrison replied, adjusting his spectacles. The strongest piece isn't always the most obvious one. The Phantom, now in custody, demonstrated an unprecedented interest in Harrison's methods. Each attack we launched, he explained to the Marshal, revealed new layers of strategic depth. The entire town was like a living lesson in the futility of conventional violence. Iron Jack, who had spent years studying demolition and fortification, found himself documenting Harrison's innovative designs. The way you integrated defensive capabilities into ordinary structures, he noted, it's revolutionary. Every element serves multiple purposes while appearing completely mundane. Kate Sullivan's saloon had become a gathering point for professional gunmen and lawmen alike, all discussing the implications of what they'd witnessed. He didn't just stop the Phantom's gang, she observed. He demonstrated that intelligence and precision can systematically overcome any amount of brute force. Dr. Chen, presenting her medical findings to the Marshal, highlighted the unprecedented nature of the engagement. Every defensive measure was calculated to exact specifications, she reported. Even in the heat of battle, each response was precisely engineered to incapacitate without causing permanent harm. The transformation of Silver Gulch had implications beyond mere defense. Harrison's strategic innovations challenged fundamental assumptions about conflict and resolution. Professional fighters who had relied on violence their entire careers found themselves questioning their basic methodologies. Your reputation from the Apache Wars, the Marshal noted, about bloodless victories and impossible strategies. But this goes beyond military tactics. You've created a system that makes conventional warfare obsolete. Harrison's response was to demonstrate another aspect of his workshop's capabilities. Notice how wood grain affects structural integrity, he explained, showing a complex joint. Force, like any natural principle, can be guided rather than simply resisted. Young Robert, who had witnessed the entire night's events, began collecting Harrison's teachings with new understanding. All those lessons about reading grain patterns and calculating stress points, he realized. You were teaching principles that apply far beyond carpentry. The Marshal's investigation revealed more layers of Harrison's strategic genius. Every modification to the town over the past 6 months had contributed to an integrated defense system. Simple repairs and renovations had quietly transformed Silver Gulch into a sophisticated tactical mechanism. Your methods could revolutionize law enforcement across the territory, Thompson observed, creating systems that prevent violence rather than merely responding to it. The implications of Harrison's victory reached beyond Silver Gulch. Professional lawmen from neighboring territories arrived to study his innovations, each discovering new layers of strategic sophistication in his seemingly simple modifications. The psychological impact is remarkable, noted Sheriff Davis from Copper Creek. Your defensive systems don't just stop attacks, they systematically demonstrate the ineffectiveness of violent approaches. Harrison continued his work, restoring the town's ordinary appearance while explaining key principles. In both craftsmanship and strategy, understanding natural patterns allows for more efficient solutions. The Phantom's captured men provided unprecedented insights into the effectiveness of Harrison's methods. Every standard tactic we tried, one veteran gunman explained, revealed another layer of his preparation. It was like fighting against someone who could predict and counter. Our thoughts. Marshall Thompson, documenting the innovative defense systems, recognized broader applications. These aren't just tactical improvements, he noted. This is a fundamental shift in how we approach law enforcement. Prevention through design rather than reaction through force. Dr. Chen's medical records revealed another revolutionary aspect. The precision of his defensive measures, she reported to gathered officials, demonstrates that effective law enforcement doesn't require lethal force. Every response was calculated to neutralize threats while preserving life. Kate Sullivan's saloon became an informal academy as Harrison explained his methods to interested lawmen. Notice how each modification serves multiple purposes, he demonstrated. Like a well-designed joint, strength comes from how elements work together rather than individual components. The transformation extended to the Phantom's men themselves. Iron Jack, now assisting in documenting Harrison's innovations, found new applications for his demolition expertise. He's shown us how understanding structural principles can prevent conflict rather than create destruction. As evening approached, Silver Gulch had become more than a successfully defended town. It stood as proof that intelligence and precision could systematically overcome violence, that strategic genius could render conventional warfare obsolete. Month after the Phantom's defeat, Silver Gulch had transformed into something unprecedented in the American West. Harrison's workshop, once mocked by local ruffians, became an unofficial academy where lawmen and former outlaws alike studied the principles that had revolutionized frontier justice. Remarkable how perspective changes, Marshall Thompson observed, watching Iron Jack demonstrate Harrison's defensive principles to a group of territorial deputies. A month ago, these men were among the most feared killers in 3 territories. Now they're teaching lawmen how to prevent violence through strategic design. Harrison continued his work, those craftsmen's hands shaping both wood and wisdom. Understanding often comes from unexpected sources, he replied, adjusting his spectacles. Though I find carpentry particularly useful for demonstrating fundamental principles, the town itself stood as testament to his innovative approach. Every structure that had played a role in the Phantom's defeat now served as a practical example of how intelligent design could systematically overcome brute force. Your methods have spread beyond Silver Gulch, Kate Sullivan reported, her saloon now a gathering place for students of strategic defense. 3 towns along the border have already begun implementing similar systems. Raiders hit Copper Creek last week, turned back without a single shot fired. Dr. Chen's medical practice had evolved to include teaching battlefield medicine with a revolutionary focus. Prevention through design, she explained to visiting physicians. Harrison's systems demonstrate that protecting life requires more precision than taking it. The Phantom, serving his sentence in the territorial prison, had become an unexpected advocate for Harrison's methods. His detailed accounts of the battle for Silver Gulch circulated throughout the West, teaching outlaws and lawmen alike that intelligence could systematically defeat violence. Each failed attack taught us something. Morrison's letters explained. Every standard tactic we attempted revealed new layers of strategic depth. The Carpenter didn't just defeat us, he demonstrated why our entire approach to violence was fundamentally flawed. Young Robert had grown into his role as Harrison's primary apprentice, understanding now that he was learning far more than mere woodworking. Notice how force flows through connected points, he explained to visitors, demonstrating with a complex joint. Whether in furniture or defense, strength comes from working with natural principles rather than against them. The transformation extended beyond physical structures. Silver Gulch's success inspired a new approach to law enforcement across the territory. Towns began emphasizing strategic design and prevention over reactive force, creating systems that made violence increasingly ineffective. "Your Apache War's reputation makes more sense now," Marshal Thompson noted, studying Harrison's latest innovations. "Those impossible victories, bloodless battles, they weren't about superior firepower. They were about understanding fundamental principles that make conventional warfare obsolete." Harrison's response was to demonstrate another aspect of his craft. "In both strategy and woodworking," he explained, "the strongest solution isn't always the most obvious one. Sometimes subtle design achieves what brute force cannot." The workshop itself had evolved, becoming a living demonstration of his philosophy. Visitors found themselves surrounded by examples of how simple materials, properly understood and precisely applied, could create sophisticated solutions to complex problems. "Remember when they mocked him?" Old Samuel reminisced, watching another group of lawmen study Harrison's methods. "Called him a bookish carpenter playing at defense. Now they're learning that true strength comes from understanding, not force." Iron. Jack, who had once specialized in destruction, found new purpose in teaching Harrison's principles of protective design. "Every structure contains tactical potential," he explained to his students. "The key is understanding how to guide force, rather than simply resist it." As summer turned to fall, Silver Gulch stood as proof that intelligence and precision could systematically overcome violence. Harrison's legacy wasn't just in the buildings he'd modified or the systems he'd created, but in demonstrating that the most effective defense isn't the one that looks most impressive, but the one that makes violence itself ineffective. The callous hands at the dusty saloon no longer laughed at their scholarly carpenter. Instead, they learned from him, understanding finally that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom and precision required to protect without harm. In Silver Gulch, the equation of justice had been solved not with gunsmoke and blood, but with the careful calculations of a craftsman who brought the principles of precision to the art of peacekeeping. And if you're riding through the Western Territories thinking that strength comes only from force, remember the lesson of the carpenter. Sometimes the deadliest strategist is the one who creates rather than destroys. A year had passed since Harrison's victory, and Silver Gulch had become something of a legend in the West. A town where strategy had replaced gunfights, where the principles of defense and design had shifted the very foundation of frontier justice. What once had been a haven for outlaws and violence was now a sanctuary of order and intelligence. The local newspaper, the Silver Gulch Sentinel, had recently published an article titled "The Revolution in Justice," which chronicled the town's transformation. The story spread, drawing people from distant territories to witness the living proof that pacifying violence didn't always require bullets. Harrison, however, had yet to be fully recognized for his revolutionary impact. His methods were so subtle, so deeply integrated into the very fabric of the town, that many still did not fully understand the breadth of his work. One such person who had come to grasp the true significance was Marshal Thompson. He had been a visitor to the town many times since the battle, and had seen firsthand how Harrison's influence had spread. He'd watched as towns from across the territories began to adopt Harrison's defensive designs, and it was now evident what had seemed like a series of clever tricks had become a new doctrine for law enforcement and conflict resolution. The Marshal sat in the saloon one afternoon, sipping coffee as Iron Jack, now a fully-fledged teacher of defensive strategy, led another group of deputies through a demonstration. The wooden scaffolding and false walls Harrison had designed were being used to teach the deputies how to assess danger and neutralize threats without violence. "You see," Iron Jack was saying, his voice carrying over the murmur of conversation, "these structures don't just serve as barriers. They're a statement. If you attack, you will be caught in a net of your own making. Every corner has a purpose. Every angle is calculated. Marshal Thompson leaned forward, his mind racing. The way they're teaching this, he thought, isn't just about tactical maneuvers. It's a shift in how lawmen perceive their role in society. These men are learning to think beyond force. They're being taught that their greatest tool is their mind, not their weapon. Across the room, Harrison was quietly sitting at his usual table, sketching the latest design for a defensive system. The town had grown, and with it, so had the need for greater innovation. He was no longer just a carpenter in the eyes of most. He had become the chief architect of a new way of thinking about peacekeeping in the frontier. Kate Sullivan approached, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "We've had a visitor, Harrison," she said, sitting down beside him. "A delegation from Santa Fe. They want to implement your designs in their entire district." Harrison paused for a moment, adjusting his glasses. "Santa Fe?" he murmured thoughtfully. "It's one thing to transform a town like Silver Gulch, but to apply this to an entire district, it's a different challenge." Kate grinned. "The whole town, the whole territory, every lawman across the district wants to learn your methods. They understand now. Violence isn't the only answer." Harrison leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers together. "It's encouraging, but what they'll need to understand is that these designs aren't a one-size-fits-all solution. The principles are universal, but each place has its own terrain, its own rhythm. It will take time to adapt." Kate nodded. "You've made them see that there's more to defense than shooting first and asking questions later. They're eager to learn, Harrison. The changes you've sparked are spreading faster than I thought possible." As Harrison turned his attention back to his sketches, old Samuel wandered in, nodding a greeting. The old man, who had seen countless battles in his day, now spent his time mentoring younger men in the new philosophy of law enforcement. "You're a quiet genius, Harrison," Samuel said, pulling up a chair. "When we first came to this town, we thought you were just a craftsman, a harmless carpenter. But now look, whole territories want to learn from you. You've made an impression no gunfight could ever match." Harrison smiled faintly, but there was no arrogance in his expression. "The greatest victories come not from defeating your enemy, but from changing the conditions in which they fight. In this case, I've simply made it clear that the old way of doing things, violence and force, doesn't have to be the only option. I don't believe in glorifying war or confrontation. I believe in giving people a way out." Kate's eyes softened. "You're teaching them how to avoid becoming the very thing they hate." "Exactly," Harrison replied, his voice steady. "By understanding the underlying structures of conflict, we can design ways to avoid it altogether. Lawmen don't have to be the enforcers of violence, they can be the designers of peace." As Harrison spoke, his mind began to work on new concepts. What if, he thought, the principles I've taught here could be further expanded, not just for law enforcement, but for whole communities? What if we could design peaceful systems in every aspect of life? His thoughts were interrupted when Dr. Chen walked in, her medical bag in hand. She had become an advocate for the new approach to conflict resolution as well, applying it to her own medical practice. "Harrison," she said, her voice full of excitement, "I've seen the changes in people, in their injuries, in the way they recover. The preventive measures you've designed have lessened the severity of harm people face. You've not only prevented bloodshed, you've created a culture of healing." Harrison's eyes lit up. Healing is as much about preventing harm as it is about treating injuries. That's why the systems must evolve beyond defense. If we focus too much on damage control, we miss the opportunity to prevent the harm in the first place. Marshal Thompson stood up, nodding in agreement. "It's true. The more I see, the more I realize we're on the brink of something revolutionary. The rest of the territory's taking notice. This could change the very fabric of law enforcement in the West." Harrison glanced at the group that had gathered around, each person understanding something different, but all linked by a shared realization. Violence didn't have to be inevitable. "It's not just about defending," Harrison said softly. "It's about designing a world where defense isn't needed in the first place." The room fell into a contemplative silence, each person understanding that Harrison's work was just beginning. What had once been a small town's defense against an outlaw gang had blossomed into a new philosophy, a philosophy that could reshape the very landscape of the West. And for the first time, Silver Gulch wasn't just a place on a map. It had become a symbol of something greater. Months passed, and the influence of Harrison's work spread beyond the borders of Silver Gulch. Delegations continued to arrive, some from distant towns, others from regional lawmen eager to adopt his revolutionary methods. The news of the Carpenter's Code, as it had come to be called, had even reached the larger cities, where law enforcement still relied heavily on armed intervention. Yet despite the growing interest, Harrison remained humble, continuing his work in the quiet corners of Silver Gulch, guiding his apprentices and fine-tuning his designs. One particularly notable visit came from a group of engineers and architects from Denver, who were eager to learn how Harrison had applied his woodworking principles to military defense. As they sat in his workshop, Harrison demonstrated how simple materials like wood, stone, and iron could be combined in ways that no one had thought of before. "Each material," he explained, "has its own inherent properties, but when you understand how to manipulate those properties, they can serve multiple functions." The engineers were astonished by how quickly they grasped the applications. What had seemed like mundane carpentry now appeared as advanced engineering. One of the architects, a tall man with a neatly trimmed beard, leaned forward in awe. "We've been designing fortifications for years," he admitted, "but we've never thought of integrating functionality into every single structure in the way you have." Harrison smiled, though there was no boastfulness in his demeanor. "It's not about innovation for the sake of it," he said quietly. "It's about creating solutions that fit into the natural order of things. Forces, whether physical or social, all have patterns. The key is understanding them and adapting to them, rather than resisting them." The group of engineers left Silver Gulch with more than just knowledge. They left with the seeds of a new approach to design, one that prioritized prevention, foresight, and efficiency. Harrison's quiet genius had not just altered how they thought about defense. It had opened their eyes to a completely different way of solving problems. But it wasn't only engineers who came to Silver Gulch. Several lawmen from towns near the Mexican border arrived, some carrying personal stories of raids and attacks that had taken a heavy toll on their communities. They arrived hoping for guidance, perhaps a glimpse of the magic that had allowed Silver Gulch to stave off an entire gang without shedding a drop of blood. Sheriff Davis, who had become a staunch advocate for Harrison's approach, was among those who had invited them. "The most important lesson," he told the visiting lawman, "is that we aren't just designing defenses. We're designing opportunities, the opportunity for peace, the opportunity for law and order without the need for constant confrontation." The visiting lawman spent days observing, learning, and even assisting in modifications to the town's defenses. They were astonished at the simplicity and efficiency of Harrison's systems, marveling at the way each element contributed to a larger, harmonious whole. Some of them had been skeptical when they first heard about Harrison's methods. Now they could see how deeply they could apply these principles to their own communities. "It's not about just building something that looks good," one of them, a young deputy named Wheeler, remarked during a discussion in Kate Sullivan's saloon. "It's about thinking through every possible outcome and designing for the one that makes the most sense." Kate, who had become one of the town's most ardent supporters, added, That's right. When I first met Harrison, I didn't know what to think. He was a quiet, bookish man, just a carpenter. But now, I see how much more he's doing. He's not just reshaping towns, he's reshaping how we think about the world. Back in his workshop, Harrison had begun to consider how to formalize his methods into a set of guidelines that could be shared far and wide. It can't be just about architecture, he thought. It has to be about a way of thinking, one that transcends buildings and law enforcement and can be applied to all aspects of life. Over the following weeks, Harrison wrote up a series of articles, each outlining a different aspect of his strategic design philosophy. They ranged from the fundamentals of structural integrity and defensive positioning to more philosophical ideas, like the importance of forethought in preventing violence and the psychological impact of a well-designed defense on both lawmen and outlaws. He called this new philosophy the art of prevention. The articles were published in several regional papers, and before long they had been circulated throughout the frontier. Even more towns began to implement his designs, not only for defense but for community building. Harrison's ideas sparked a conversation about how law enforcement could evolve, how violence could be minimized without surrendering justice, and how the very idea of conflict could be redefined. Despite the growing recognition of his work, Harrison's life remained rooted in the same simple principles. He continued to teach his apprentices, including young Robert, who had grown into a gifted craftsman and strategist in his own right. Robert had become a trusted assistant in both the workshop and the broader project of community defense. He had learned not just the practical skills of carpentry, but the deeper principles that Harrison had imbued in every joint and beam. One afternoon, as Robert worked alongside Harrison, shaping a particularly complex piece of wood, he asked, "Do you think they'll ever truly understand what you've done here, Harrison? Or will they just see it as another clever trick?" Harrison paused, looking out at the town he had transformed. "It doesn't matter, Robert. What matters is that we've created something lasting. If others take up these ideas, then perhaps they'll begin to see the bigger picture. It's not about credit. It's about creating a future where we don't need to fight as much. If people understand the ideas well enough to make them their own, then that's enough for me." The months turned to years, and Silver Gulch's reputation as a place of peace spread far and wide. It had become a symbol, not just of tactical brilliance, but of a new philosophy of law and order, one that rested on the idea that the most powerful weapon was not a gun, but a mind trained in the art of prevention. Even as the more traditional forces of violence continued to operate in other parts of the West, a slow but steady transformation was taking place. Harrison's teachings were no longer the exclusive domain of Silver Gulch. Towns along the border, in the plains, and even in the mountains were beginning to rethink their approach to justice and defense. And all the while, Harrison continued his work, hands steady and sure, building not just structures, but a new world, one in which strength came not from destruction, but from creation. His legacy was not in the workshops or the manuals, but in the people who had learned that peace, true peace, required the most precise, calculated, and thoughtful kind of strength, the strength to build rather than to break. As the years passed, the transformation of Silver Gulch deepened. What had once been a rough, wild frontier town now stood as a testament to the idea that a community could thrive without the constant threat of violence. It had become a gathering place, not just for lawmen, but for philosophers, engineers, and even diplomats who came to study Harrison's ideas. Word had spread far beyond the American West, and his work began to attract interest from across the continent and even abroad. One crisp autumn day, a letter arrived at Harrison's workshop. It was addressed with an elegant hand and came from the office of the United States Secretary of War. The contents were straightforward, but the implications were staggering. The U.S. government had taken notice of Harrison's methods and was inviting him to Washington, D.C. to present his principles to a wider audience, including military strategists, engineers, and law enforcement leaders from across the nation. When Harrison read the letter, he sat still for a long time, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of his workbench. Young Robert, who had become his closest confidant, was the first to speak. "This is it, Harrison. This is the recognition you've deserved." But Harrison merely sighed and set the letter aside. "Recognition is fine, Robert, but the real work, our work, is here. It's with the people we've already helped. It's in this town, and those who've embraced this philosophy." Robert stood quietly for a moment, then nodded, understanding that for Harrison, the mission had never been about fame or titles. It had always been about creating a lasting, meaningful change, but there was no denying the potential impact this invitation held. "You've already changed the West," Robert said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's time to show the rest of the country what's possible." After some reflection, Harrison decided to accept the invitation. He knew the potential for his ideas to spread further, even though he remained conflicted about leaving the peaceful world he had cultivated in Silver Gulch. He agreed to go, but only on the condition that he would not present his ideas in grand speeches or as a man with all the answers. Instead, he would demonstrate his principles through action, through practical examples that anyone could understand. In Washington, Harrison was greeted with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. The bustling city was a far cry from the quiet streets of Silver Gulch, but it was a place where ideas collided and institutions were forged. The halls of power were filled with influential figures from the military, law enforcement, and even academia, all curious to see what the Carpenter could bring to the table. When Harrison arrived at the appointed time, he was led into a large conference room where a diverse group of officials and military strategists were waiting. Among them was Colonel Henry Winslow, a gruff man known for his tactical brilliance, but equally known for his disdain for unconventional methods. "Mr. Harrison," Colonel Winslow began with a skeptical glance, "I've heard the stories. Some say you've managed to design a way to avoid violence altogether. How exactly do you plan to prove that to us?" Harrison, dressed as simply as always, his spectacles perched on his nose, responded calmly, "I don't plan to prove anything, Colonel. I'll simply show you how violence can be avoided through design, through understanding the natural forces that govern both conflict and cooperation." The room buzzed with murmurs. Some were eager to see his methods in action, while others remained doubtful. Harrison had been asked to demonstrate the practical application of his ideas, and he did so by first giving a tour of a small-scale model he had created of a typical frontier town, one similar to Silver Gulch. This model had been intricately designed to show not just the architecture, but the underlying principles of defensive strategy. He explained how each building, each piece of wood and stone, had been selected and positioned with purpose. The defensive features were subtle. There were no towering walls or barricades, but instead strategically placed narrow alleyways, windows designed to be easily secured, and fences that could be swiftly reconfigured to create choke points. "The key," Harrison said as he pointed to a model of a saloon, "is to integrate the defensive elements into the town's everyday life. A town doesn't need to be a fortress to be safe. It just needs to be intelligently designed to guide people's actions. It's not about preventing conflict through force, but through preparation." Winslow, who had been silent, leaned forward and studied the model more closely. "You're telling me this town could repel an entire gang without anyone firing a single shot?" "That's correct," Harrison replied. "If the town is structured to anticipate danger and redirect it, then the need for violence is eliminated. The key is in the psychology of it. An attacker sees no way to win, no advantage, and will retreat before escalating to violence." Some in the room were impressed, but others remained unconvinced. "You can't simply redesign everything to prevent violence," said General Lambert, a veteran of countless battles. "Sometimes you have to fight back with force." Harrison nodded, his eyes thoughtful. "There are always exceptions, General. But most conflict, most violence is the result of misunderstandings, poor preparation, or desperation. By designing systems that predict and prevent conflict, we can remove the root causes before they spiral out of control." The presentation continued, and over the course of the day, Harrison demonstrated how his principles could apply not just to town layouts, but to military tactics, law enforcement strategies, and even urban planning. He discussed how the same principles of structure and flow could reduce the likelihood of violence in cities, on battlefields, and in homes. At the end of the day, as the officials filed out of the room, there was a quiet shift in the air. Some had come in skeptical, but they left with a deep sense of curiosity, even admiration. Colonel Winslow, who had been one of the most vocal critics, approached Harrison before he left. "I'll admit, Mr. Harrison, I didn't think your ideas would amount to much," he said gruffly, "but I've seen enough to know that you've started something big. If nothing else, you've made us rethink how we view conflict." Harrison, ever humble, simply nodded. "I'm not here to change everything in one day. I'm here to show that a more thoughtful approach can make conflict unnecessary, or at least less inevitable." As Harrison returned to Silver Gulch, he knew the work was far from over. The ideas he had shared in Washington had sparked a movement, but it was just beginning. The real challenge lay in ensuring that these principles were implemented on the ground, in every community, every town, every city. Back in Silver Gulch, the town had grown even more peaceful in his absence. New families had arrived, attracted by the promise of safety and community, and the lawman who had learned from Harrison continued to spread the word. The once dangerous town was now a thriving hub of culture and commerce, where cooperation reigned, and violence was a distant memory. But for Harrison, the work continued. There was still much to be done. There were still minds to change, towns to influence, and systems to refine. Yet, through all the accolades and newfound recognition, he remained steadfast in his mission, to prove that the greatest strength lies not in force, but in the wisdom to design a world where peace is the default, not the exception. And so, Silver Gulch stood, not just as a town, but as a living example of what could be achieved when violence was no longer seen as the inevitable answer. In the world of the American West, a place once defined by blood and gunfire, the true legacy of Harrison's work had only just begun to take shape. The future, as it seemed, would be built not on the foundations of conflict, but on those of careful, intentional design. Months turned into years, and Harrison's influence continued to ripple across the West. Silver Gulch had long since ceased to be just a model of defense. It was becoming a symbol of a new era, where towns were built not for war, but for peace. Even beyond the borders of the territory, people began to notice the quiet transformation of the frontier landscape. Cities, once rife with conflict, started to implement Harrison's principles. They redesigned public spaces, revamped law enforcement strategies, and began to teach conflict resolution through intelligent, non-violent methods. But not everyone embraced these changes. In a distant town on the edge of the territories, a notorious outlaw named Samuel Hawk Rook had been hearing rumors of Harrison's work. Hawk, a man whose entire career had been built on exploiting fear and violence, dismissed the Carpenter's peaceful strategies as naive. "You can't make men like us bend," he scoffed to his followers one evening in his camp. "A well-timed bullet is the only thing that ever makes a man listen." Hawk's gang, known for their ruthless raids, had heard the stories of Silver Gulch and its miraculous defenses. Enraged by the idea that a carpenter had become a legend while outlaws like themselves were forgotten, Hawk decided to challenge Harrison's approach. He set his sights on Silver Gulch, convinced that the town's ideals were nothing more than an illusion waiting to be shattered. He gathered a group of hardened men, each as skeptical as he was of the Carpenter's peaceful methods. "We'll show them the reality of life on the frontier," Hawk muttered, clenching his fists around the handle of his revolver. "A town built on peace is a town built on weakness." Meanwhile, in Silver Gulch, Harrison continued his work, expanding his network of collaborators and teaching those who came to study his methods. Word of his success had spread across the territories, and now people traveled from far and wide to learn from the man who had made peace possible in a place where violence once ruled. One evening, as Harrison and Robert were discussing a new defense system designed for a neighboring town, the sheriff came in with a grim expression. "Harrison, there's word of a gang moving toward Silver Gulch, Hawk Rook's men. They've been seen in the area, and they're known for their bloodlust." Harrison stood and adjusted his spectacles, his face betraying no hint of alarm. "Then we shall prepare, but we won't meet them with guns or force. We'll meet them with strategy." The next morning, Harrison gathered a group of townspeople, including lawmen, carpenters, engineers, and even former outlaws who had turned their lives around through his teachings. They would not face Hawk Rook's gang with weapons. Instead, they would rely on their knowledge of design, psychology, and the principles that had transformed Silver Gulch. "Let them come," Harrison said quietly, his calm voice cutting through the air. "They will find no weakness in this town. There is no room for violence here." As the day wore on, Hawk's gang arrived, and the townspeople watched as they approached. The outlaws' rough, arrogant demeanor contrasted sharply with the serenity of Silver Gulch. They marched down the main street, expecting to intimidate the townsfolk with their presence. But what they didn't expect was the silent, calculated precision of the town's defenses. The first thing they noticed was the subtle shift in the environment. Normally, the town would have been bustling with activity, but now there was a stillness, a quiet that made the outlaws uneasy. As they reached the town center, the streets seemed too narrow, the buildings too well positioned, the alleys too easily cut off. Hawk's men tried to draw their guns, but in doing so, they triggered one of Harrison's carefully designed traps. Hidden, wooden slats in the street, activated with a soft, almost imperceptible click. The ground under their feet shifted, not enough to cause harm, but enough to momentarily destabilize them, throwing off their footing. It was a subtle reminder that the town had been built with purpose, not just for beauty, but for defense. "Move back!" Hawk barked, his face tightening in frustration. But as his men tried to reposition, they found themselves caught in another trap. A series of cleverly designed wooden panels swung down from the rooftops, momentarily blocking the streets. Hawk and his gang were now surrounded, not by force, but by the intelligent design of the town's layout. Harrison, standing calmly on the town's perimeter, watched the situation unfold with measured focus. As Hawk's men tried to regroup, they found every attempt to retreat blocked by walls that, to the untrained eye, appeared to be nothing more than decorative structures. Yet, in reality, they were fortified with carefully placed supports and reinforced materials, designed to reroute or contain intruders without causing harm. Hawk's frustration grew. "This is a trick," he muttered. "Where are the guns? Where are the men who'll fight us?" Robert, standing beside Harrison, glanced at the town's transformed streets. "They're here, Hawk. They're just invisible. They've been built into the very fabric of the town." One of the outlaws, who had once been a resident of Silver Gulch, spoke up. "I told you. This place ain't what you think. It's not the people you need to worry about. It's the way the town's built." Harrison didn't just teach him to fight, he taught him how to make violence unnecessary. Hawk's eyes widened with realization, but it was too late. A group of townspeople, led by former outlaws who had turned their lives around through Harrison's methods, approached slowly, unarmed, but confident. They stood between Hawk and the exit, blocking his path. "This is what you don't understand, Hawk," one of the townspeople said. "You've built your life on violence, but that's not what this town is about. We've learned that force is a tool, not the solution. This town was designed to make it unnecessary." Hawk glared at the people before him, rage boiling inside. Him. But as he looked around, something began to sink in. The town had no weakness. There were no obvious threats, no men in the shadows ready to ambush them. It was all designed to disarm their instincts, to make them feel the futility of their violence. Finally, Hawk, his pride wounded, lowered his revolver. "You think this is the future?" he spat. "A future of weakness? Where men don't stand up and fight for what's theirs?" "No," Harrison answered, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "It's a future where we don't have to fight at all." After a long, tense moment, Hawk and his men turned and retreated, their egos bruised, but their lives spared. They left Silver Gulch, knowing they had encountered something they could not overpower with sheer violence. The townspeople stood silently, their victory not one of bloodshed, but of intelligence, precision, and design. Harrison looked around at the faces of those who had helped him, and a small smile tugged at his lips. They had proven once again that peace was the most powerful defense. Hawk Rook and his gang would not be the last to challenge Silver Gulch. But with each new trial, Harrison's vision grew clearer. He had proven that design, whether in the form of carpentry, strategy, or community, could reshape the future. Violence, once seen as the only solution, was now a thing of the past. The new frontier was not one of chaos, but of careful, deliberate action, and Harrison, the humble carpenter turned strategist, knew that as long as towns like Silver Gulch stood, there would always be hope for a future built on peace rather than force. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.